Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. We've got you covered. Traditional leagues, Dynasty League, PPR League, IDP League, even Daily Fantasy Football League. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Thank you for tuning into the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, where I will give you advice on everything there is to know about fantasy. I'm your host, Jeremiah Martinez, and like every Tuesday show, I'm here by myself. And to begin things off, we're going to be talking about last night's Monday Night Football game, and then later on, I will talk about some injury news regarding a certain quarterback, Dak Prescott. Is he worth to own right now? I'll be talking about the Chiefs' backfield, and I will give you my top waiver wire pickups for Week 7, like I end every show on Tuesday. So let's start off with last night's Monday Night Football game. That was between the Arizona Cardinals and the New York Jets. The Cardinals did win this game 28-3, and David Johnson was the star of this show. He was the fantasy star last night. And man, oh man, did he put on quite a show. The patience that he showed on some of these runs, especially the long one, the long 58-plus yard run in the beginning of the first quarter, that was quite a run. But moving forward, David Johnson is probably a top 3 running back right now. He does lead the league and total yards from scrimmage. That is over Ezekiel Elliott as well. So he is someone that is a must-start moving forward. If he hasn't already been starting your lineups, you need to start him now. But he is someone that's probably going to, I think, I was very high on David Johnson coming into the year. He's someone that I thought was going to have a great fantasy year. I know my colleague on the football show, Alex, said he wasn't high on him at all. But I think he's a top 3, top 5 running back moving forward. But there was a couple of disappointing performances last night, and you got to, especially from the Jets. You got Brandon Marshall, who I didn't think he was going to have a huge game because, he is playing against Patrick Peterson and this tough Cardinals defense, but I kind of thought he would have performed a little bit more better. He did have 70 yards. He did have 6 targets, but that was about it. No touchdowns at all. And a huge drop-off from production for the Jets receivers was really, it fell off so quickly. Because Marshall was the leading receiver at 70 yards, and then the next leading receiver was at 43 yards. Yeah, that's pretty disappointing. And for the Cardinals, the receivers were pretty disappointing in this game too. I kind of thought this offense would have been more explosive on the passing game, especially against this Jets defense. And the leading receiver for the Cardinals was Josh Brown. He only had 54 yards. It was John Brown, not Josh Brown. But John Brown was the leading receiver for the Cardinals, and he only had 54 yards. Larry Fitzgerald didn't do so well either. He only had 49. So this receiving group for the Cardinals was pretty disappointing for my ad. So, speaking of the quarterbacks on these teams, Carson Palmer, this is a pretty disappointing performance from him, I might add. I think this was very, very disappointing. He only had 213 yards passing and a touchdown against this Jets defense that was practically been torched this time right here. I don't know. I think Carson Palmer, he's starting to look a little old, but if this offense runs through David Johnson, I don't know if Carson Palmer's a must start anymore. I don't think he is. He's starting to worry me a little bit as a QB1, as a top must-start play, because he was a must-start going into this game, and I don't know if he's like that anymore. I just don't see that same Carson Palmer that I saw last year. I just don't see it. Well, looking forward to the Cardinals' schedule here. They play Seattle on Sunday Night Football. That's a tough game. I think the only must-start player against the Seahawks defense is probably David Johnson. I can't see Carson Palmer doing anything against this Seattle defense if he can barely top over 200 yards against the Jets defense. And then they got the Carolina Panthers. I think that can be a potential good game for the Cardinals' skill players. I think that's a good game for Carson Palmer. That's a good game for John Brown. That's a good game for Larry Fitzgerald. And then they have the bye week after that. So, like I said, David Johnson's a must-start moving forward. Carson Palmer, I think he's not droppable yet. You can't drop him. But I do think he's someone that you have to monitor. I think he's better suited as a backup quarterback in your lineup as of right now. But I wouldn't consider him must-start like I did in this game. But going to the Jets side of the ball, I think it's safe to say Ryan Fitzpatrick should not be on any fantasy radars at all. That's all I'm going to say. No matter who starts, no matter who is the quarterback, you can't trust any of these Jets players. You just can't. Like Brandon Marshall, if Geno Smith started, which he's not, Todd Bowles did say Ryan Fitzpatrick's going to start this Sunday, I would lower your expectations a little bit from Brandon Marshall. Even though, because he is the leading guy now with Eric Decker on the IR, he is someone that you probably should not get your hopes up about. Matt Forte, he has not been anywhere since his big game in week 2. And going to the Cardinals receivers here, it looks like Michael Floyd's not really a part of this team. He's just not. He did have a touchdown last night, but he's just not a huge part of this offense. And he's someone that pretty much shouldn't even be on rosters right now. He is not a part of this offense at all. But moving forward, I do think the must-start fantasy contributor is David Johnson as of right now. But moving on to other top performers this week, Odell Beckham finally comes alive, guys. Finally came alive. Can you believe that? He had 222 yards receiving and 2 touchdowns against the Ravens. And 211 of those yards came in the second half. So Odell Beckham's finally breaking out. Finally. And I know I was excited because I am an Odell Beckham owner myself. And I can see him possibly continuing his performance. Now, I'm not going to say he's going to get 200 yards every game, but I see him as a really great contributor moving forward. He does play the Rams in London this Sunday, so I think he will have a good game there. And he does have the bye week after that. So I think he's someone that I told you guys, you have to trust him. You have to be patient with him. He's finally breaking out. I do think he's going to finish as a top 3 in the position at receiver. So I'm telling you guys, don't lose your hope in Odell Beckham. I told you guys, he finally broke out. And then, man, what about Lesean McCoy? He's just absolutely torched this 49ers offense on Sunday. Lesean McCoy, man. He did get a little bit of a scare there. He was grabbing his knee, I think, in the first half of the game. And I thought he was going to be out for the rest of the game. But, man, he came back, and then he just absolutely torched this 49ers run defense, who looked pretty embarrassing, I might add. And then I talked about it on Friday with Anthony. Lesean McCoy he was a top 3 start this week, and I think he's still that way moving forward. Looking at the Bills' schedule here. They do play Miami, and then they play New England. Miami, I do expect a pretty good game. And then New England, I kind of expect to drop off a little bit, but I do see him scoring some touchdowns. He is highly involved in his offense. The Bills have a run-first offense with Tyrod Taylor to helm. And I do see Lesean McCoy finishing as a top 3, top 5 starter at the running back position this season. And then Lamar Miller. Lamar Miller played pretty good against the Colts on Sunday night. 149 yards, 29 receiving yards, and 2 total touchdowns. Man, he has turned into a pretty relevant fantasy contributor, and he was drafted as a early second round pick, and I have him pretty high as myself. He is in a run first offense, and he has not disappointed at all. This is probably his best game of the season, and I do see him as a very top fantasy contributor moving forward. And then we're going to go back to the quarterbacks now. Drew Brees put on quite a show versus the Carolina Panthers. 465 yards and 4 touchdowns. And he did throw 1 pick. But that he did have over 30 yards and 30 points in this game. Drew Brees, he's always going to sling it. Always going to sling it. And as long as this team is in shootouts, you're always going to have to expect big numbers from Drew Brees. He does play Kansas City in Week 7, so I don't expect him to have as high of a production game as he did against the Panthers, but I do expect him to be solid. The Kansas City Chiefs do have a good defense, and he also has Seattle the week after that. So he has a couple of tough matchups coming up, but I would still happen to start him. And Week 9 is the big money matchup when he going against the San Francisco 49ers. And I do expect him to contribute in that game. But for the next 2 weeks, I don't expect Brees to light it up. But I do expect him to be solid. And what about Case Keenum? Case Keenum against the Detroit Lions. Man, 321 passing yards and 4 total touchdowns, 1 on the ground, 3 through the air. At one point, Keenum had more touchdowns than incompletions, and it looks like Jared Goff's probably not going to play a snap this season if Keenum plays this well. And this is his best game of the season by far. By far, this is his best game of the season. He was not on my fantasy radar at all this weekend, and I think if he has a couple more starts like this, you got to start taking notice of him. Because looking at the Rams' schedule here, he does play the Giants in London, which I think it could be a potential good game. He does have the bye week. Then he has Carolina. It could be another potential good game right there, too, because Carolina's defense has not been the same defense as it was last year. So I don't expect Keenum to light it up like that every week, but if he does have if he's on a hot streak, so to speak, I think you have to start paying attention to him. He can be on the streaming radar, so to speak. But, man, the Rams offense, man, they put on quite a show. And then sticking with the quarterbacks here, Marcus Mariota put on the show as well versus the Browns. He had 284 passing yards, 64 on the ground, and 3 touchdowns. And I did talk about Marcus Mariota on the Tuesday show last week. He did have a lot of good matchups of being a top waiver wire pickup, and, man, he is not disappointed. He did put up good numbers against Miami. He did have his best game of the season against the Cleveland Browns, and he has pretty good matchups for the next 3 weeks. He has Indianapolis, he has Jacksonville, and San Diego. So I do expect Marcus Mariota to put up good numbers for the next 3 games, and I don't know, he may turn into a QB1 by the end of those games. And I'm going to go back to the running back position here, and I think people have to start talking about Terrence West as a pretty good fantasy running back. He's not been talked about at all. I'm surprised by that. He has taken over the number 1 running back role in the Ravens backfield, and he had his best game of the year versus the New York Giants. He had 87 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, and 36 receiving yards. So he is pretty good. He gets over 100 yards. He gets a lot of touchdowns, and they actually turned into a run-first team after firing offensive coordinator Mark Trestman. And having that running game, I think they're going to include Terrence West a lot more moving forward because it opens up the passing game for Joe Flacco. So I do expect Terrence West as a pretty good top 10, top 15 running back moving forward. And we got to talk about Jay Ajayi. Wow, who would have thought Jay Ajayi would have had the first 200-yard rushing game of the season? Who would have thought that? Wow. I'm just saying right now, I will talk about him later in the waiver wire pickups, so stay tuned for that. And he did also have 2 touchdowns against the Steelers. And Kenny Britt, someone on my waiver wire pickups this week, 136 yards, 2 touchdowns versus the Detroit Lions. He is the clear number 1 Rams receiver in that offense. And I will talk about him as well in my top waiver wire pickups of the week. But those are this week's top performers. I will take my first break, and I will get into some news about the Chiefs backfield, the Steelers offense, and I'm going to talk about some Dak Prescott. Yes. We will have all that for you after the break here at the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And welcome back to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. And it's time to get into some running back talk. Yes, the money position in fantasy. And I think the Kansas City Chiefs backfield, I think it's going to be hard to figure out now. It's not as clear-cut as I thought it would be. I did think that Jamal Charles was going to get more time against the Oakland Raiders, and he did. But I thought he was going to contribute a lot more. But there has been a twist in the Chiefs backfield as of this morning. The Kansas City Chiefs have traded now Davis to the Green Bay Packers. So it kind of does open up a little more opportunities for Jamal Charles. Ian Rappaport did report that the Chiefs were waiting for Charles to get healthy to move on from Al Davis. And Kendrick West is probably the third running back. He's most likely probably going to be possibly have a limited role in this offense. But moving forward, Spencer Ware and Jamal Charles, I think they both need to be owned in all leagues. Jamal Charles, I know he's not the same workhorse that he was, but he still needs to be owned in all leagues. Now, Spencer Ware has earned a role. He needs to be owned in all leagues as well. So going back to the Chiefs game against the Raiders this past weekend, Spencer Ware did have 131 rushing yards, 32 receiving yards, 1 touchdown. Jamal Charles had 33 rushing yards, 14 receiving yards, and 1 touchdown. So, are any of these running backs trustworthy moving forward? I do think Spencer Ware is more trustworthy than Charles right now. I think Spencer Ware, he is someone you need to own. He's probably the back to own right now for the Chiefs, but I would think both of these running backs need to be owned in all leagues. Jamal Charles is probably best served on your bench right now until we see a little bit more out of him. But the Chiefs, they do have a couple of really good matchups moving forward. They have the New Orleans Saints. They got the Indianapolis Colts in Jacksonville. So those are really good matchups for Jamal Charles to get back on track, and we can possibly see him have a breakout game within the next 3 or 4 weeks. So I do think that is why Jamal Charles needs to be stashed in fantasy teams right now. In my opinion, I do think Spencer Ware is the better running back to own right now, but Charles, you can't write him off right now. But talking about another offense in AFC, what should you do with the Steelers offense? Well, it looks like Ben Roethlisberger is going to miss Sunday's game against the Patriots. And so that leads me to the question, is Antonio Brown, Le'Veon Bell still playable and valuable this Sunday? Of course they are. You cannot sit Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell ever in fantasy. And this is probably a better game for Le'Veon Bell anyway. Le'Veon Bell is probably going to be the workhorse of the offense if he hasn't been already. This game plan is literally going to go through Le'Veon Bell against the Patriots this Sunday, and I expect a huge game from Le'Veon Bell. As for Antonio Brown, I do expect his production to drop off a little bit, but he is the best receiver in the game, and I do expect him to adjust with Landry Jones as the quarterback. But as for the rest of the Steelers' offensive players, Sammy Coates and Jesse James are better off left on the bench. I don't see him having a good week against the Patriots, but in season-long leagues, you kind of have to play Brown and Bell, but in daily leagues, I would avoid Brown and Bell, Sammy Coates and Jesse James, even Eli Rogers for that matter. Yeah, I would have to avoid those players. But it looks like something I want to point out here is that Big Ben came into Sunday with just 4 absences over the past 3 years, and those 3 missed games were in 2015. So Big Ben has been healthy, and that's why he was so valuable this year. But I do think Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell, I don't expect a huge drop-off from them. But we're going to move on to a quarterback who has emerged himself as a kind of a waiver wire option, so to speak, and I think he needs to be owned. I think it's time to start paying attention to Dak Prescott, guys. I really do think so. Let's look at his numbers from game by game. Okay, 227 yards, no touchdowns at all versus the Giants in the first game of the year. Okay, he's a rookie. Okay. Washington, 292 yards, no touchdowns through the air, but went through the ground. So, okay, a little bit better game. 248 against the Bears, 1 touchdown, 1 on the ground, 1 through the air. Okay, a little bit better game. And then the 49ers, I expected him to have a pretty decent game, and he did. 245 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. So I was like, okay. And then against the Cincinnati Bengals, which was a game dominated practically by Ezekiel Elliott, did have 227 passing yards and 1 touchdown. But he finally had his breakout game against the Packers. He has 247 yards this past Sunday with 3 touchdowns through the air. So I do think he's someone that needs to be starting to take notice. He's not someone that you're going to start. He's not a must-start moving forward. I don't think he's someone you should start right away. But he's someone that can be pretty valuable on your fantasy team. And for you guys that don't have Big Ben, I think Dak Prescott is the guy that you need to get right now. Or Marcus Mariota. But Dak Prescott is practically a target I would get if I don't have Big Ben on my team. And looking at his total numbers from the season, he does have 10 total touchdowns and 1 interception, and he doesn't turn the ball over, so I do makes him valuable in fantasy. So I do think Dak Prescott is someone that needs to start being noticed more, and he's a very useful streaming option, and he can practically emerge himself as a top fantasy running back by the playoffs, and that is very important, guys. So I do think Dak Prescott is someone that you need to take notice. But we're going to take our second break here to Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, and I'm going to tell you my waiver wire pickups for Week 7, like I always do every Tuesday. We'll be right back here at the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And welcome back to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. And it's time for the waiver wire pickups for Week 7, guys. And I got about 4 names here that you need to add to your team. First one, of course, is obvious, Jay Ajayi. He looks like he is the workhorse. He looks like he is the number one running back in the Miami Dolphins backfield. He out-touched Foster 26-5 against the Steelers on Sunday. And don't forget, he did have the first 200-yard rushing game of the season, guys. But Jay Ajayi has found the end zone 4 times in his last 4 games, and he's averaging 5.7 yards an attempt. So I think he's someone that is locked in as an RB2 moving forward. And he's obviously the top waiver wire pickup of the week, and he's someone that can practically, I think he can be a top 15 running back at the end of the season. And going back to Kenny Britt, who I talked about briefly earlier in the top performer segment, he is the number 1 receiver in the Rams passing offense, which is not really much of a passing offense, but they showed up against the Lions on Sunday. And Kenny Britt leads the Rams in receptions and yardage. He's on pace for his best season at all. I think he's on pace for more than 1,300 yards receiving. He has 9 plays of 20-plus yards. He has top 60 yards in 5 of the last 6 games. And he has a pretty favorable schedule coming up. He has the Giants, Panthers, Jets, Dolphins, and Saints. So he's someone I do think that needs to be taken seriously. I think he needs to be owned in several leagues. If you really need running back help, I think Kenny Britt is someone you need to add on your team, and he looks like he could be for real. We might talk about him on Friday in that segment, but I would take notice of him. He's someone that needs to be added right now. And Thursday night, the Packers do play the Bears, and I think Ty Montgomery is someone that needs to be added. I think he's a really valuable ad this week. He was targeted 12 times versus the Cowboys on Sunday. He did have 98 yards on 10 receptions. And Devontae Adams did leave the game with a concussion. Adams hadn't practiced this week so far, so he's still in concussion protocol. Eddie Lacy is nursing a bad ankle, and James Stark is nursing a bad knee. And with now Davis is barely getting to the Packers squad today, I can see the Packers using Ty Montgomery as a running back and a receiver in a hybrid role this Thursday against the Bears. I do see that, and Montgomery could be a good short-term investment on your fantasy teams. I think he's valuable this week. If you can't get Kenny Britt and Jay Ajayi, I would try to go for Ty Montgomery as a valuable short-term option this week in your lineup. And that's for my final waiver wire pickup of the week, Hunter Henry. Yeah, Hunter Henry has emerged as the Phil Rivers top target. In the last 4 games, Hunter Henry has 18 receptions, 24 targets, 290 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Even with Antonio Gates in the lineup, Henry looks like he's going to be a key part of the Chargers offense. So, I think he is the top waiver wire pickup for a tight ends position. And you know how the tight end position usually is in fantasy. I think Hunter Henry is valuable because Phil Rivers has to throw to somebody. He has emerged as the number 1 target in that offense. And, Phil Rivers is always going to throw it. The Chargers are always going to throw it. So Hunter Henry is very valuable. He's probably the second most valuable pickup of the week behind Jay Ajayi. And those are my waiver wire pickups of the week, guys. I will be back on Friday. Anthony will be back here too. And we're going to be discussing the Thursday night game as well as some players who we think are for real or not. And we will look ahead to who to start and who to sit for Week 7. As always, I'm Jeremiah Martinez, and thank you for listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. You can catch the show on a variety of platforms on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, YouTube, even on the website, GSMCpodcast.com. You can also follow the show on Twitter at GSSMC_FFootball, even on the Instagram account at GSMC_FFootball. You can also like us on Facebook at the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. And I'll see you on Friday. You guys have a good week and have a good day.